But yeah, if you didn't do it, that really stinks. I mean, it really does. Hey, folks, it is January the 21st, and we're going to continue on with our lecture series over the Cold War. Just as a reminder, if you've not turned in your Iron Curtain paper, you need to do it. That counts as a quiz grade. I am considering, I'm going to review and see where we are, but gosh, I'm kind of moving towards, we might have a test next week. A lot of my kids are testing next week, but I might put it off for the week after that. I'll let you know by Tuesday what I decide. It kind of depends on how far we make it. So, but the bar moves every now and again. So, okay. So here, let me pull up the lecture notes and see where we left off. Yeah, we were talking about the birth of modern Israel. And so this is going to be one of those places that's going to have a lot of contention. A lot of world's going to watch it because both Russia and America are going to get very involved in North Africa and the Middle East, which is a very unstable region up to this day. And they thought that somehow, and there was always a worry that these little proxy wars we talked about could lead into a world war, a nuclear world war, which is no bueno. All right, so here we see on the right we have Mao Zedong. He is the leader of the Communist Revolution in China, which is a revolution that started before World War II, but when the Japanese invaded China, it was kind of put on hold because the Chinese nationalist, who is the legitimate Chinese government at the time, was also on their side fighting Japanese invaders. And so, however, the Chinese nationalists will lose the Chinese Revolution, and they will do self-imposed exile to Taiwan, which up to this day is still a place where there's a lot of international contention because Taiwan claims independence from mainland China, but mainland China claims ownership of it. And they still have a government composed of these people who fled China after its communist revolution. So that's one of those hot button issues today. All right, so events in Asia. Japan's government was reshaped into a modern democratic system while under American occupation. This happens in quite a few places that are occupied by the U.S. government. After the Korean War, South Korea is going to be occupied by the U.S. government. It's going to become one of the most economically, and educationally, and technologically advanced nations on the earth. The same for Japan. And it's not so much just because the military is there, it's because both of these countries had already come with cultural traditions that meshed very well with modern lifestyles and workforce and education already in place. So once you sprinkle in a lot of these ingredients, it really took off. In China and Korea, communist revolutionary forces were making headway. So much like Russia, where we had the Bolshevik Revolution, in China, you also had a growing movement of they were often funded and supported by Russians, but not officially. These revolutionaries. We'll talk more about Korea in a bit. But during World War II, the nationalist Chinese government, led by Jiang Jiechi, had begrudgingly aided Mao Zedong and his communist forces in their fight against Japanese occupation. So they were in a bloody civil war, but they called a temporary truce to overthrow invaders, because Japanese occupation was not only foreigners invading their country, they're also extremely cruel, and they knew that neither side would survive if the Japanese stayed in a full-on occupation, because the Japanese literally were doing horrifying things to the Chinese people at this time. They were enslaving them. There was mass murder and rape. They were doing medical and torture experiments on these people. It was like horrendous. So both sides fought against the Japanese. In 1946, however, the truce between these two parties collapsed and civil war broke out in China. So once that war was over, they were like, hey, game on, and they started killing each other again. Though the U.S. supported the nationalist movement, President Truman believed that aiding them would have been a waste of American resources. By 1949, Zhang's army, that's the Nationalist Army, fell apart, and what remained of their government fled to Taiwan. Now, it's going to be a pretty brutal civil war. The nationalist forces were largely, in some cases, they were incompetent. They weren't able to put up a good defense against the communists. In other cases, they were very undersupplied. Western nations like America, promised them like weapons and supplies and stuff, but rarely delivered. Whereas China, being next door to Russia, had a constant and reliable supply of weapons, munitions, and war supplies coming in from Russia constantly for the communists. Because they're like, hey, we have common ideologies. It's like we both, and communists love the idea of spreading communism. So it worked out fairly well for Mao in this operation. And as they moved along, the Maoists would often take cities, and whenever they would siege a city, they used an old form of siege warfare where they surround it and they essentially starve the people within it until they quit, while giving them messages of promising food, comfort, and aid if they would just give up. And when people are starving, they do that kind of thing. So this is going to be kind of like I told you. Remember, we talked about the domino theory. If Russia is communist, the countries around it will become communist. This looked like evidence to them to be like, hey, see, we were right. We got to stop this or it's going to spread everywhere else. So, which is going to help explain Korea and Vietnam and all this other stuff later. And when I say nationalist, it's not to say that the communists didn't have nationalist principles themselves. Like when they took over, they were very much about Chinese language, Chinese culture. They wanted to get rid of what they saw as Western influences, such as Christianity and Western forms of education, a lot of Western art. They wanted to get rid of that. So it was also, so they did want to preserve that, but it wasn't for all Chinese people because within China, there's multiple races. But gosh, I forgot the name of what you might normally think of as Chinese people. Their minority groups were definitely discriminated against. Like if they had Mongolian blood or if they were Uyghur, which are like Western Chinese people, they were very heavily discriminated. To this day. All right, folks. So, yeah, this is a picture of an atomic bomb, but this isn't an American atomic bomb. This is a picture of Russia's first atomic bomb. So now the Russians have this as well. When Americans find out that the Russians had stolen our atomic weapon secrets and managed to have this very same super scary, devastating weapon, Americans freaked out. It totally changed the game. No longer did we have a monopoly on the world's most fearsome weapon. And now somebody could do it to us. It's going to cause like an entire age of anxiety. So, which I titled Anxiety for the West. Following the defeat of the nationalist government in China, Truman refused to recognize the People's Republic of China and ordered the U.S. Navy to send one of its fleets to Taiwan. So they sent the fleet down there to defend them. They're like, oh my gosh, we kind of let the country fall in a way we didn't want to because we didn't think it was worth it, and now we regret it. Meanwhile, in 1949, the Soviets successfully detonated their first atomic bomb. In response, the next year, Truman increased the military budget by $12.3 billion, which was a lot of money back then, including the cost to develop a new, more powerful hydrogen bomb.
Oh, boy.
It's an atomic bomb on steroids, right? So they're like, well, they might have the A bomb like we used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now we have hydrogen bombs, which could take, instead of taking out a large city, could say take out like a whole county, or several counties. So the bombs were getting bigger and more destructive. Tensions in occupied territories post World War II began to intensify as time went on. As at the war's end, the Soviets occupied the northern part of the Korean peninsula above the 38th parallel, while the Americans stayed in the south. So Korea is just sticking out of the southern portion of China, and it's across a very small bit of water to get from Korea to Japan. We had American forces in now friendly Japan. We were also seeing that China fell, and we felt terrible about that. But now Korea was going to face the same problem. Truman did not want to make the same mistake again in his eyes. And so both Soviets and Americans left the country after it was divided into two, with Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee leading in the south. And so like for Koreans, their last name is their first name, right? So you still have a Kim in charge today of North Korea. So we saw that Mao led a communist revolution, took over China, and now another guy much like him, Kim Il-sung, is doing the same in Korea. And he was on very good terms with Mao too, and we just didn't understand just how strong that relationship was, or just how worried the Chinese would be about having Western military so close to their country. I'm going to say it's not going to turn out too well. Glad the internet's working better. I couldn't stream my last class. It was all choppy. Couldn't get it. Wi-Fi didn't always work well. I wish I could just have a good desktop and just like put a landline in the wall and just stream off a camera. Just work a lot better.
Mr. Reiner, are you going to sign up for your daughter to the Girl Scout this morning?
My wife and I talked about it. Like she said, she said she might want to do it as long as it's like through a church, but we're not sure because for one, gosh, they're in a lot of stuff right now. Like they're in and as they get older, we're going to start pulling them out of some things. But since they're little, they're in gymnastics once a week. They're in swimming once a week. And then they do jiu-jitsu with me twice a week. So that's it. Well, they do one of those things 2 times in one day. But that's like 3 days a week. They're like doing after school stuff. And eventually it's going to start getting expensive. It's not too expensive since they're little and they got reduced prices and all that. Whew. I don't know. Like it could be good, but I don't know. When I was a kid, I always wanted to do Boy Scouts. But I'm not sure if my son's going to get into it or not. Let's see how things turn out. No, I'm just, like, I don't want to be cynical, but I'm kind of like, is it worth it?
I never went to Girl Scouts.
You didn't?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I never went to Boy Scouts, so I had a brother did it, but I was just kind of like, because I don't know. I kind of think like a lot of the good stuff. I'm like, can't I just do that? Can't I just show them?
If you okay. You might not be able to recall, but boxes have less and they cost more.
Oh, really? Yeah, I actually asked my mom. I was like, "Hey, you want to get you some Girl Scout cookies?" She's like, "No, they cost too much." I was like, "Okay, that stinks."
It's $1 more, and they're giving out less. It's $5. It's 5 per box and 6 for like.
So you can go like Family Dollar and get like so many boxes of cookies.
Yeah.
But they,
See, that's what we'll do.
Nowadays, it's
We'll just be like, there's a 5, give me these.
nowadays it's like packaged less and it costs more.
See, that's a rip. I mean, you're hoping you're helping out the kids, but I mean,
I think it's because the people aren't signing up for Girl Scouts anymore.
yeah, I know they and the Boy Scouts have been like a big decrease in like
Well,
membership.
Because the Boy Scouts thing was kind of sued for
Yeah.
molestation.
Yeah, and that's like serious. Nobody wants their kid to go
Like
through
$1
that.
million case about child molestation against Boy Scouts.
Oh yeah, yeah. I see commercials all the time. It's like if you were in the Boy Scouts and XYZ happened, it's like, ooh.
Whoa.
You're entitled to financial compensation.
Yeah, yeah. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. I think it comes up on like YouTube sometimes. It's like what? So, in case, hey, how about Korea? So, hey, like I told you, see, here's Korea, and you see that Korea is here's my mouse. Korea is right there, sticking out at the southern part of China, but also you got Japan as well, which is right across there. And that's one of the reasons why if like Japanese language and culture, I mean, not Japanese, Korean language and culture is kind of like a mix in some ways of China and Japan. Well, for one, they've kind of been invaded and taken over by both countries, if memory serves. But it's just how it is. So, and here you see that line, the 38th parallel, which separates, see 38th parallel, it's a line of demarcation on the map. North Korea, still here today. South Korea, still here today. Remember, if you're getting on a plane, getting tickets, make sure you fly to this one, not this one, okay?
Wait.
So, go to the south one, not the, it's not showing my mouse. Let me see, let me throw it on, maybe I'll put it on the pointer. Yeah, go to this one, not this one. So, like, you end up here, you might end up in an internment camp. You end up here, you might just eat Korean barbecue and play video games. So, there's it's a little different. So, all right. After the American-Soviet withdrawal, both Korean governments claimed to be the rightful Korea. So this Korea is the best. With approval from the Kremlin in 1950, Kim Il-sung. Now the Kremlin is, just think about the political head of Soviet Russia, okay? Kim Il-sung, the leader of communist North Korea, began a near completely successful invasion of South Korea. He's like, hey, Russians, I'm going to invade South Korea and make it into mine. Is that okay? Russia's like, yeah, go for it, buddy. And he almost did it. President Truman then asked the UN to intervene in Korea. So Truman was like, oh my gosh, they beat up our friends. They're taking over almost the whole country. So he asked the United Nations, which is this collection of countries that's supposed to defend its whole goal is to keep world peace, really, right? And so they asked the UN to intervene in Korea and called for a ceasefire. It's like, hey, stop killing each other. We're going to come in and fix this, while calling for UN support for South Korea as a police action. So this is going to be the first time where we have U.S. forces do a massive invasion of a country without declaring it as a war. We're going to call it a police action. We're just there to keep international law. This is an illegal invasion. Both sides agreed to not do this. They broke the rules. We're going to go stop it. Though nearly 70% of Americans supported intervention, most Americans are like, yeah, let's go stop this. The National Guard and the reserves and the draft was needed due to low volunteerism. So most Americans are like, let's go do it, but not me. Send somebody else. And so they're like, oh, shoot. So they had to get all the part-timers to do it instead. And then they had to do the draft, which is like, hey, your number come up. You're in the Army today. I'm like, oh, shoot. Okay. So because a lot of people just didn't sign up, like World War II and World War I. With General Douglas MacArthur as the head of the UN forces, only the southern tip of the peninsula was held by American forces. So by the time we got there was barely any land left in the friendly forces side. And MacArthur was one of those guys from World War II. He led a lot of the Pacific War, if you'll remember. in World War II. He was a guy who lost the Philippines and abandoned his troops and eventually came back, and is going to be there for the declaration of surrender from Japan. So, yeah, this is my granddad's war. This is the one he was in. Yeah, my grandfather. He was actually a missile technician, but they signed some kind of weapons armistice where both sides agreed to not use missiles. And so when he got there, they didn't have the missiles. So instead, I think it was called like Nike rockets or something. So instead, he just had to drive a Jeep. So he was like a taxi service for Army guys. So. This doesn't sound too bad. It sounds better than being at the front. I'm sorry, Kayla. You get a lot of headaches. Do you need glasses?
I have them, but I'll tell you a lot of migraines.
Honestly, it's
Okay. It's all right. That's the thing. A lot of things can cause migraines.
Such a school.
Okay, so yeah, some people get from the lights. Some people get from smells.
I've never had a migraine or a headache. So I wouldn't know.
What?
I'm the only one of them that I cannot get one. And I don't understand how.
So like a cough from.
Yeah, sheesh.
You like this?
Take boxing lessons and don't cover up. That'll give you a headache. All right, so Korea. So here we have some, I think they're Marines. I think they usually have that camouflage helmet cover. So here we have the invasion, because when you're just holding one piece of land, well, you definitely want to hold more land, especially if you're trying to free your allies from foreign control. Well, not foreign, but, like an invasion. So the Korean War. In September 15, 1950, 70,000 U.S. soldiers landed in the center of Korea near Seoul in the Battle of Incheon. So here's the thing. So MacArthur was like, man, gosh, or should we just go to where our friends are and fight our way all the way up? Or use boats from Japan and just attack them from behind. So he did that. So he attacked them from behind and encircled them. The surprise attack turned the war around for the Americans as the North Korean army fell apart. The North Korean army wasn't really a match for modern Western forces. And of course, it wasn't just the U.S., we also had British and a lot of our allies from Europe, I think like Australia. It was a coalition, right? As the North Korean forces fled back across the 38th parallel, the goals of the police action had been accomplished. We said, we're going there to push them back across that line. They said they wouldn't cross, and they were going to be cool. However, with UN backing, American forces pushed past the 38th parallel in order to reunify Korea. They're like, hey, this was so easy. Why don't we just take all of it and give it to the South Koreans? Let's just get rid of the whole communist thing. By November the 24th, 1950, so just like a couple of months, the UN American Army had made it to the Chinese-Korean border at the Yalu River. We did it. We got all of Korea, and it was liberated for the South Koreans to just kind of unify in more of a modern government. Unfortunately, though, 2 days later, China sent around 300,000 troops into Korea. See, after the Communist Revolution, China was isolated from the rest of the world. We had no information coming out of it. We didn't know what they were thinking or what they wanted to do. They refused to talk to our diplomats. And so behind the scenes, Mao was getting really super worried about this revolution being turned back. Because he's like, if they take Korea, the Americans will come to China and they're going to kick me out, and they're going to give the government back to the government in Taiwan. They're like, I can't let that happen. And so he got his army ready, and he prepared them for months. And by the time they reached the river up there, they did a surprise attack. And it was actually during a snowstorm, where they just sent these 300,000 soldiers. Many of them didn't even have firearms. They just had grenades, bundled up in coats, and they would tie tight bands around their limbs to act as tourniquets. So if they got shot in the arm or something, they wouldn't bleed out. They could continue fighting. A lot of these soldiers were, because they were so poor, their army, they didn't even have like a lot of radios and stuff like that, or machine guns, or like rifles that could shoot at a good distance. They were doing like almost what you might call medieval charges, led by bugles to let them know the commands to go forward. But because it was so many of them, and because it was a surprise attack, they overran a lot of the army and many Marines. I got a good book about some Marines that barely made it out. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir. It was a lot of these soldiers and Marines ran out of ammo, and it was just hand-to-hand fighting. They were unable, because of the snowstorms, to even call in airplanes or artillery to help them out. So it was just really rough fighting, just like in the worst parts of World War II. And it was so bitter cold. A lot of people froze to death too. So it was like really, really nightmare scenario, right? And we're going to have a lot of our forces just totally like hightail it out of there and try to go back south to get parallel for safety. So tough fighting. I think we're going to do one more, and then we're going to call it good. I don't like lecturing too far after 30 minutes. I don't think it kind of, it's like, even if you like go to college, if you're like taking a 3-day week course and it's like 45 minutes, only about 30 minutes of that's going to be lecture. And even like in college, you'll like notice a lot of 20-year-olds start to fall asleep by the end of it. You only got so much attention span before you start tuning things out. So we'll just do one more. Yeah, once we start talking about like the 70s, then I think we're going to start. I'm going to hand you your book. Solzhenitsyn. All right. So here's some soldiers. I think these are actually Marines taking a rest and posing for a picture during that snowstorm as they're retreating back from Chinese invasion. Remember, the Korean forces had largely been decimated, but so now they're fighting unexpectedly the Chinese army. The Chinese invasion shocked the U.S. and the UN forces as many units were surrounded and overrun. U.S. casualties were high, as 12,000 men, while the communists lost over 3 times that many men. But they didn't care. One of the reasons why this war was so attractive to Mao in China is after the Communist Revolution, he was like, I got a lot of people in this country who don't like communism, and they're not happy I won and took over the country. So he had an idea on how to get rid of them. He'll just make them join the army and go fight Americans. And if the Americans kill him, he won't have enemies in his country anymore. So that, I mean, people do that. Like tyrants do that kind of thing. So they had a lot of incentive to send troops in to basically like just meat grinder waves, right? Over the next 3 years, UN and U.S. troops were pushed back to the 38th parallel, back where we started. MacArthur called for the bombing of the bridges along the Yalu River. That's the border between Korea and China. He wanted to use atomic weapons to totally decimate the north part of Korea so bad that the Chinese forces would never be able to cross back over again. Basically, he wanted to cause a climate disaster by making so much radioactive material there that humans wouldn't be able to survive even passing through.
Like Chernobyl levels?
Yeah, like it was like crazy man stuff. And he also wanted a naval blockade of China. Just totally cut them off. Have all of our ships right there pointing guns at their coast. And he used Chinese nationalist forces to attack China. So he also wanted to get all the people of Taiwan, to make them into a military, just invade China, just totally just take over. It could have been done. However, Truman only allowed him to bomb the bridges with normal bombs. So at least cut off the supplies. But he didn't want World War III. He knew if he would have helped an invasion of China, and if he would have used atomic weapons, and if he would have used the Navy to essentially destroy Chinese ships that were even peaceful ones, or stop them, that Russia would get involved, and then we would be in a war against Russia and China and Korea. And we don't know what our allies would have done, because our allies really did not want us to use atomic weapons. So we probably would have lost friends in that whole endeavor as well. So, yeah, Truman was like, "You're crazy, MacArthur. What a bad idea." So, and that is going to do it with our Korean lecture for today. We're going to come back and we will end the Korean War on Tuesday. And then we're going to move on to what were the 50s like throughout a lot of America. And then I believe we're going to talk a little bit about civil rights. And then we'll talk about Kennedy, Vietnam, Nixon, Watergate, so on and so forth. All right. So that's going to do it. Talk to you later.